Hi, this is Gordon Goldsborough with the Manitoba Historical Society, and today I'm speaking about a mapping project that the MHS has been doing for about the last 10 years. I'm going to talk about what the project is, how it came about in the first place, how we collect information and then do research to follow up, the uses we think this collection of information can serve, and right at the end I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can help. But before we get into it, I just wanted to point out, people sometimes ask me about this particular photo. They ask, is it real? Or did I just Photoshop that sign? No, it's real. This was a sign that was near a monument for Croydon School in the municipality of Brenda-Wiskata down in southwestern Manitoba. The sign, I'm told, however, is gone. They've taken it down, maybe because they perceived that there really isn't a reason to be cautious approaching a historic site. Now, for those of you who haven't visited it, we have on the website for the Manitoba Historical Society an interactive map of historic places. The URL for it is here, mhs.ca/map2. That'll actually take you to another address where you'll see this interface. Now, the way it looks will depend on the kind of platform that you're using to view the map. This particular version is what you would see if you were using a desktop computer. You have 3 panes. On the left-hand side is a map, and the symbols on the map denote the various historic places. And as you'll see a little bit later, the various types of symbols denote different kinds of places. In the center, we have a list of the various sites. In other words, for every symbol on the map, there is a corresponding entry on the list in the middle. And then on the right-hand side is the search interface, and that's where you can have the map show you various types of things. And I'll show you a little later how you can use that and the various tricks and tips for getting the most out of it. Now, it is configured to sense the kind of computer or kind of device you're using when you look at this map. So, for example, if you look at it with a smartphone, it reconfigures itself so that what you see, in fact, is the map alone, but there are some buttons at the top that'll either show the list or the search interface. So all of the same information is there, the same symbols are there, but it's just presented in a slightly more compact way so that you can literally carry this around with you and search it on the go. And in fact, the symbols on the smartphone version are responsive to touch, that you can touch on the symbols on this map and a little bubble will pop up. On the desktop version on the left-hand side here, you could actually click on them with a mouse and it'll do the same thing. And then it'll bring up more information that it will provide you for each of these historic sites. Now, as of now, the inventory is just a little bit under 8,000 sites, and it grows almost day by day. About 3/4 of the collection is outside of Winnipeg, simply because, of course, there's a vast area outside of Winnipeg, and so it stands to reason that a lot of things would be outside of the city. And if you look at the list, we've broken it down into various categories. So we have symbols on the map. Those are the various little symbols you see there. So the little red houses represent buildings of various kinds. The little headstone is representing a cemetery. The little green crosshairs denotes a location. And what that represents essentially is that if you were to go to that spot, you would see nothing. Because there isn't anything there now. Now, that's not to say there wasn't something there in the past, and that's the whole idea, that a location is quite literally where something in the past was. We're preserving knowledge of these things that are now gone. The little green, or the little blue shield is the site of a monument. The little pink building, I guess you could say, is a museum or an archive. And the little tri symbol, the little circle, square, and triangle represents sort of miscellaneous sites. Because, to be honest, over the 10 years of this project, it has grown far beyond what we initially expected. And we just simply can't anticipate all the various kinds of sites that we might want to put on the map. So that last symbol, sort of a mixture of all kinds of symbols, is to denote sort of miscellaneous. That's the collection. If you add up those numbers, you will find that it doesn't quite equal 7,961 because there are sites that actually have 2 or more categories assigned to them. So, for example, if you go to the site of a church, if there is also a cemetery associated with that church, it could be in the building category, it could be in the cemetery category, and it'll show up under either one. So the numbers won't add up because of that. There's various, multiple categories that apply to some sites. So this project got started in 2004 with something called History on Board. The idea was that somebody came to us, the Manitoba Historical Society, and proposed a project where we would put up billboard signs around Winnipeg to promote awareness of historical museums, both within Winnipeg and around the province. And we said, okay, go ahead, put out the proposal. They did. It was funded, at least partially, to investigate the idea. And, well, that's where it began. But as we began to think about it, well, first of all, one of the problems was that the person who got the project started very soon afterwards left the province and left us to finish it on our own. And as we thought more about it, we decided that it maybe wasn't the best idea to use billboard signs to promote awareness of museums. For example, a billboard sign, you can't put a lot of information on it because people only have a second or two to see it and to understand the message that the billboard is conveying. You look at any billboard sign and they are very simple messages. And that means that, the kind of detail you could provide about these museums was pretty rudimentary, as compared to the internet, where you can provide as much or as little as you want. And of course, the more information you provide, the more deeply people can dig, and they, in theory, could find all kinds of information. So you could, in theory, give them all sorts of very detailed information using the internet. Of course, if you provide a billboard sign, then they really only can get the information that's on the sign, unless you provide them with some link to somewhere else. You could say, contact the Manitoba Historical Society for more information, and then we could provide it to them. But of course, that's something that is just perfectly adapted to the delivery on the internet. That if somebody's interested in something related to a particular place, you could say, click here for more information. So, as compared to billboard signs, the internet was looking pretty good. The other big problem is that the duration of the information is variable. So with billboard signs, you pay for them. They are up for as long as you pay. As the minute you stop paying, the billboard comes down. And of course, it means that unless you have a continuing budget, the information is really only there for a short period of time. Versus the internet, yes, there is a cost of hosting websites, but it's relatively modest. And it's there indefinitely as long as you pay those hosting bills. And so the cost is relatively low for the duration that you get. And then I think most significantly is, where does the information get presented? So if it's a billboard sign, it's to the neighborhood in which the billboard is put up. In other words, the only people who see that billboard sign are the ones in the immediate vicinity who drive past it, as opposed to the internet, which of course is global. So pretty much everything about the internet was a better way, we thought, to present this information about historical museums, better than billboard signs. And so we went back to the original agency that had funded the proposal and said, could we reconfigure it so as to do something different, not billboard signs, but instead to deliver the information on the internet? And the agency said, yes, go ahead and develop that. So you see here the list of museums we began the project with, 12 of them altogether, and some of them are around Winnipeg on a variety of themes, and some of them are outside of Winnipeg. And that was the original idea. But as we began to think about it more deeply, we realized that, of course, the museums in Winnipeg have a particular advantage, that they have a large population that is surrounding them. And so it's probably a lot easier for them to attract visitors. The ones in areas of rural Manitoba, especially if they're far away, have more of a challenge. And therefore, we thought it was probably more useful for us to focus on the museums that didn't get the same sort of traffic, that we could basically tell Winnipeggers about these wonderful resources outside of the city if they were just willing to travel a little way. So that's how the project evolved. It was really an attempt to draw people's attention to museums that they perhaps didn't know about and would enjoy if they traveled a little further afield. So we reconfigured the project. This is the list that we then set upon. And as you can see, we've removed most of the Winnipeg museums, and we've added several other museums outside of Winnipeg. And again, the idea is to draw people's attention to these wonderful resources around the province and hopes that they would want to visit them. So this is the project as we envisioned it in 2006, that instead of being focused on billboard signs, we were going to focus on the internet. Instead of having a wide array of museums around Manitoba, we would focus particularly on rural ones that maybe people weren't quite so familiar with. Well, unfortunately, the project languished for another 4 years. And during that time, our thinking changed again. You're thinking that if we were going to be traveling to a museum, along the way, we would see all sorts of other things that we might find interesting. We might see buildings that we didn't recognize. We might see monuments that we were interested in, or cemeteries. And thinking is, why not expand the experience? Rather than simply focusing on the museums that were the destination, why not make it a whole experience? Make it a trip so that you could stop along the way, you could enjoy things that you saw along the way, and make it a truly integrated heritage experience. That was our thinking. Well, in 2007, something happened that really, I guess, motivated how this project has come about. In 2007, my family and I traveled to Deloraine. And one of the things we did in preparation for that trip was we would look at historic things in the vicinity of Deloraine. And in the course of doing research, I discovered that there was a bank vault somewhere near Deloraine. It wasn't in Deloraine itself. And the explanation was that the bank vault had been part of a bank that was established before the railway had arrived in that part of southwestern Manitoba. When the railway did arrive, it bypassed the town. And so as a result, the people in the town basically picked up the town and moved it some distance to where the town of Deloraine sits today. But because the bank vault was heavy, it was made out of large stones, they couldn't move it, so it was abandoned. And it was supposedly still standing where it had originally been. So we arrived in Deloraine. I got some basic instructions on where it was located, and I went out driving. My family and I spent about 2 hours driving, being frustrated because we simply couldn't find it, because the directions weren't especially good. Finally, in desperation, I pulled into the nearest driveway. I walked up to the front door of the house, knocked on the door, and said, "Do you happen to know where I could find a bank vault?" And the surprised person said, "Oh, do you mean the one behind my barn?" Sure enough, there it was. You know, and it was wonderful because, you know, the person that had owned the bank vault for, you know, several generations had obviously put some time into preserving it. They had put a fence around it. They had done some repairs to the vault. And I thought, this is really an interesting sort of aspect of our history that I bet you not many people know about. And if they have the same trouble that I did finding it, they're not going to probably persevere. They're probably going to be dissuaded and not find this bank vault. There should be an easier way. And of course, today with technology, there is an easier way. You know, many of us, for example, carry smartphones. They have GPS built into them. You know, we can say to our phones, "Take me to whatever," and you can list a destination, it'll take you there. Why couldn't we say, "Take me to the Deloraine bank vault," and it can go there? Well, of course, the technology is getting to the point where it can do that kind of thing. You need, of course, the locations. You need the precise locations of these sites, the latitude and longitude. And so my thinking was, well, maybe then we should be collecting this information. We should be collecting these precise GPS locations as a guide to getting to these spots. Another thing that was happening around this same time was that Google Maps really began to develop. You know, this idea that you could have a map online, that it would have built into it a number of places. You could say, give me or I want to go to the address of something, and you could type in an address, it would take you there. So my thinking is, well, why couldn't we expand that Google Maps experience by adding historic places to it as well? And that's really where the evolution of this project got underway. I guess it could beg the question, why is the Manitoba Historical Society doing this project? Well, I think in one very real sense, it fulfills our mandate. Our objective is to promote awareness of and an interest in the history of Manitoba. You know, and I think if you know more about the history of the province, if you know more about the various interesting places around the province, I think you'll have a greater appreciation for it. In addition to that, of course, it isn't just restricted to Manitoba, of course, and that's why I said before that this really is a global phenomenon. The internet is available around the world, and it therefore extends our mandate to promote awareness and interest in history of Manitoba around the world. And of course, particularly when we have people with Manitoba roots all over the world who are, you know, still interested in their home province, perhaps. And many of them, of course, carry mobile devices, so that if we could make information available online, they can explore virtually when they maybe not be able to in person. And then I think finally, we are filling what I could call a commemoration gap that's left by the various levels of government. The municipal governments, the provincial governments, and the federal governments, they aren't commemorating sites the way they could. You know, I mean, there's so many places that people find interesting, that people find important, that are just not ever going to be recognized by some level of government as significant. And yet there's no reason that these places couldn't be marked on a map so that people potentially 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, can go and explore and find. So that's kind of why we think this is a good idea. Of course, it also begs the question, what makes a site historic? And I think the answer to that is that the site is noteworthy to someone. And I realize that's a pretty vague criterion, and I realize that it probably leaves open pretty much everything. But if we make it a little more, you know, narrow and say, well, if there was a larger number of people, like if there was a dozen people who all thought this place was interesting, or, you know, a half a dozen, you know, maybe that warrants. And if you put it into a database and nobody cares about it, well, what does it really hurt to add it to the database? You're not incurring significant cost, so why not? So that's the main criterion, is that it must be noteworthy in some fashion. But other than that, it can be a wide range of things. So it could be, for example, an object, you know, and of course that means it could either be something that is built or some natural phenomenon that either exists today or existed in the past. Remember I said before about those locations. It could be an object that is no longer there, but was there at one time. Or it could be an event that occurred at a particular site. Something important, some kind of noteworthy occasion occurred at a particular spot, or it's occurring there today. Or it's a person that is connected to a site. You know, maybe it's a site where that person did something important. Maybe it's the site where somebody noteworthy lived or died. You know, I mean, there may be various things that are important about particular sites. And so we use a variety of criteria to choose these sites. And we err on the side of being inclusive, that if there's ever a question of should this be included or not, if somebody has convinced us that they feel passionately about it, why not? So over the last decade, the total has increased dramatically. As you can see, when we started in 2010, we had just a little bit under 2,000 sites. And today it's just about 8,000. So it's gone up by 4 times in that decade. And as you can see, looking at this graph of the number reported each year, that the rate at which we added them has changed. So in the first couple of years, we were adding quite rapidly, and then it kind of slowed down a little bit. The slope of the line was a little bit shallower as you went from 2012 up to 2016, and then even shallower as we up to 2018. And we started to think, well, maybe it's because we're kind of tapping everything out, where there's nothing left to add. But then we realized, no, you know, it's simply because there aren't enough of us participating in this. And in the last couple of years, we've had more people ask if they can help. And particularly in the last year, I've had numerous people offer information. And I think that explains the little uptick you see in the most recent couple of years. And it's got to the point now where I'm actually getting a little bit behind in putting things into the database. In fact, we're a little under 8,000 right now. If I was to work diligently to put all of the sites that are in the backlog online, well, it would be well over 8,000, I can assure you, because there's a lot in the sites list that hasn't been updated yet. But here's an example of the kind of information and the kind of parts of the province that are covered. So this is a portion of the map. And again, the various symbols denote the various kinds of things. So the blue symbols are monuments. The red symbols are buildings. The green symbols are locations. These are the locations of one-room schoolhouses around the province. And I can't say that I've been to every single one of these places, but I've been to an awful lot of them. And what it suggests, of course, is that I have seen a lot of Manitoba in the course of doing this project. And it hasn't been without cost. As you can see from this photo, I have traveled down some rather questionable roads. I'm pretty adventurous. I am quite happily to drive down mud roads. Sometimes it's at my own peril, but I found all kinds of things that I would have never found had I not driven down that dirt road. And so I'm a big advocate for taking the road less traveled, but say sometimes it has some consequences for my car. So I'll give you just a few examples. Here is a small grain elevator in the southwestern part of Manitoba, a place called Cameron. You probably won't find it on many maps. It's really not much. In fact, it never really was much, even when it was in existence. It was a railway siding. Basically, the railway went from east to west. And you can actually, in this picture, you can kind of see where that east-west line was. There's sort of a ridge, sort of a slightly different shade of color in the field where the railway track was. And the elevator was alongside the railway track. And of course, this is an example of the numerous grain elevators that once stood in Manitoba. This particular one closed in the early 1960s, and it has been abandoned ever since. And for whatever reason, the farmer who owns this property simply perceives that there's a value to it, reminding us perhaps of our agricultural heritage, reminding us of how, the small elevators used to be the norm, as compared to the big ones we have today. Whatever the reason, it's nice to see that there are a few of these elevators still out there. And so we have been mapping elevators like this one. One of my personal favorites are bridges. And here we see what's called a bowstring arch bridge. Bowstring because it kind of, I think, looks like the bow of a bow and arrow. Just outside of Crystal City. And it's one of the only 6 that, as far as I know, are remaining in Manitoba. There once were dozens of them, in fact, maybe even hundreds of them around the province, but they've mostly been replaced by various other kinds of bridges or culverts, and so it's kind of sad that these little bridges that were once so common around the province are now gone. But of course, as you can imagine, they're not especially efficient for modern day traffic. They're only wide enough to allow one vehicle at a time. So of course you can't pass anybody on the bridge. If you have big farm equipment, for example, they don't work very well. So the net result is that they, for the most part, have been eliminated. But again, mapping the knowledge of these little bridges gives you insight to how people got around. And I maintain that bridges are really important. They tell an important story of the transportation history of our province. And of course, we don't use bridges much like this anymore, but they did at one time, and it gives us insight to how things have changed. I also want to tell this sort of a cautionary tale. This attractive stone house is located south of Larivire in southern Manitoba. And as you can see, it's a very attractive 2-story stone building, built essentially by taking field stones, splitting them in half so you get a flat side, turning the flat sides facing outwards, having basically the 2 sides of the split stone facing outwards and inwards, and then you'd fill the interior of the 2 stones with rubble to make flat wall surfaces. And this house was built in 1897 by a fellow named Lang. And very attractive, but it's unfortunately far out in the farmer's field. And what that means is that people who want to go and see it have to drive through the farmer's field. And they do it in a rather disrespectful way. They often don't ask permission. They often trample the farmer's crop in the process. And they also leave garbage behind when they are visiting. And of course, they're also exposing the farmer to liability. You know, the building's over 100 years old. It's potentially going to fall down one day. And the farmer worried that if anyone was inside when it fell down, that could be disastrous. Well, not long ago, the farmer took matters into his own hands. And this is what happened. The farmer lit the building on fire. The wooden parts inside were destroyed. And then after that was done, he went in with his farm equipment and he demolished the remaining part of the building. So it's gone. The building is now gone. It's sad to think that a building that stood for over 100 years is now gone. But it's gone because I think people were fundamentally disrespectful of the landowner's rights. And although I'm the first to encourage people to travel, I'm also the first to remind people that you have to do it in a way that doesn't jeopardize the chances of some other people from enjoying these. So if it's far out in the field, you know, go only when there's no crop in the field. Hopefully go with the permission of the farmer. Certainly don't leave any waste behind, and don't venture inside unless you are certain that there's no risk. And even then, it's probably not a safe proposition. You should simply look from afar. And in fact, you know, and maybe in most cases, maybe the safest thing to do is simply to take along a pair of binoculars and look at it from a distance. You know, so that's what my attitude is. Yes, I want you to go out and explore and to see some of these places, but do it in a way that's safe, that's respectful, and it doesn't destroy the chances of for somebody else to see it, and doesn't destroy our collective history. Along the way, by the way, I have amassed some tips on what sort of things you can take with you when you're out traveling, if you are going out to travel. And here's my list. There are things that I think to be essential, things you should take along for sure. So maps, for instance, are essential to make sure you don't get lost. A backroad atlas is wonderful simply because it shows you all the various dirt roads that you might not find on the official provincial map. A GPS receiver, whether you have a fancy one or a cheap one, it's very good to take along so that you can collect the coordinates of the sites that you find. Cameras, oh, of course, you want to take pictures of everything you see. Spare batteries, a charger, because you never know when those batteries are going to die. A notebook so you can take notes. A mobile phone so you can call for help if you ever get stuck or have some kind of accident. Business cards. You know, I carry Manitoba Historical Society business cards, and I've found that sometimes when people suspect my motives, they think maybe I'm up to no good. It gives me a sense of credibility to know that I am with the Manitoba Historical Society. And so I have had a few occasions where showing them my business card, you know, and convincing them that I really wasn't there for anything more than just to document history got me out of a potentially tough situation. And then there's a variety of other optional tools that you might want to think about if you're going out for longer periods of time, taking along food and water, camping gear, change of clothes, rubber boots. Fuel, because many parts of the province, there isn't a fuel station for miles in any direction. I find that I love taking talking books simply because there's times when there's not much going on. There's not much radio reception, so talking books are good. And then, as I'll say later, I'm a big fan of drones to give you a unique view of a lot of the historic places. Now, when you get to a site, one of the things I feel strongly about is to make some notes, to document as much as possible what you have experienced. Because, you know, honestly, in the course of my travels, when I've experienced thousands of historic sites, I've forgotten an awful lot. There's things that I just don't remember. And keeping notes is a good, valuable way to remind myself. And, you know, I can remind myself of maybe the kind of buildings that I saw, what kind of condition they were in. A little sketch showing the layout of the site, you know, is a good idea. You know, any kind of information, if you find who owns the property, you can make notes of, you know, their name, their address, their phone number, and so on. You can provide details of the buildings that you may see, the age of the buildings, the kind of materials they're made from. Are they made from bricks? Are they made from stone? Are they made from, you know, various other materials? And then, of course, photography, to my mind, is essential. And by the way, for example, when I'm photographing a building, I think it's important to take photographs from all four sides of the building. And I take corner shots, meaning a view that shows two sides of the building simultaneously. And that gives you a unique way to sort of reconstruct sort of the overall look of the building. And particularly now that we have digital photography, there's no cost, essentially, to take lots of pictures. So why not take numerous photos? You can always cull them later. You can take out the ones that didn't turn out, but take lots, because it might prove to be the only photos we end up having. Because, like that house, the Lang house that was destroyed, it's now gone. And so the photos that I took in my last trip there are going to be maybe some of the only ones that exist. So take lots, as a hedge against future loss of the site. And then if you have the opportunity to take aerials, either with just a long pole, or like me, if you have a drone, even better. Because, there are just some things about historic places that you just cannot fully envision from the ground. It's only when you get up in the air, get a sort of a bird's eye view, do you really get a better sense of things. And you often see things you simply cannot see on the ground. Well, once you've got the information from the field, what do you do with it? Well, to my mind, you just don't stop there. You need to say, what is the history of the site? What's the story? I'm interested in the backstory of places, and I want to research a little more about that site. And there's various places where you can get this information. Archives are inevitably a good source. And, one of the best, for example, is the Archives of Manitoba, the provincial archives. A wonderful collection, by far the largest archive in the province, and is absolutely spectacular. Well worth a visit. And for those people who think that they're putting stuff online, well, the reality is most of the stuff at the provincial archive will never be online, so you're best to go and visit it in person. Local history books are great. They have lots of good information that is nowhere else. And we are actually in the process of digitizing a lot of them so that they are both available online and, even better, are text searchable. Local newspapers are wonderful. Things like the Manitoba Free Press, later the Winnipeg Free Press, the Winnipeg Tribune, the various other newspapers, wonderful. Especially the small community newspapers have information that is nowhere else. It records sort of the day-to-day goings-on of communities. Directories like the telephone book or the Henderson directories. If you live in Brandon or in Winnipeg, they have a Henderson directory. Biographical files that might be at the archive or at the libraries. I also didn't mention the Legislative Library in Manitoba is, again, a wonderful source of information, as well as archives and libraries all over the province. And in fact, that's one of the categories that we have mapped, are the museums, the archives, the libraries, as valuable sources of information for this research. Government documents, reports, local information. There's often no substitute for just simply stopping and asking somebody. That's the way I found out about the bank vault at Deloraine. Don't assume that everything is online, because the frank reality is it's not, and it probably never will be. It's the tip of the iceberg. Yes, there's great stuff online, and I don't dispute that, but there is so much more if you're willing to just venture to the archives, the libraries, and the people, the archivists, the librarians are be more than happy to help find things for you. So again, I refer you back to our interactive map. Again, it depends on which platform you're using to view it, whether it shows you the larger map or the smaller map, but I encourage you to try it out. So to give you some ideas of what you can do, here, let me just show you a few of the searches that you can do. So here, for example, I've zoomed in on a part of Winnipeg known as Armstrong's Point. It's near the Misericordia Hospital. It is occupying a sort of a bend in the Assiniboine River, and it's a fairly exclusive area of the city. In fact, at one time, this was one of the wealthiest parts of the city. A lot of very powerful, very wealthy people lived here. A lot of very impressive-looking houses built in this area. And so in this particular map view, what I've done is on the search panel on the right-hand side, I have specified that I want to search for building. You can search each of the categories, either building or cemetery or location, all those categories. And in the keyword field, I've put Armstrong's Point. and then I pressed the button that says Update Map, and then on the left-hand side, it put all of the things that fulfilled my criteria. So, of course, there were only buildings that it showed. I think in this case, there were only buildings in the database. But if there had been monuments or anything like that, they wouldn't have shown up because I've said I only want to see buildings. And in the middle there is a list of all the buildings, and you can scroll up and down to see all of them. They're in alphabetical order. Or you can simply click on the buildings that are on the map here, and a little bubble will pop up telling you which building it is, and then either clicking on that bubble or clicking on the particular house in that list in the middle will take you to another page that has information about the house. It tells you, for example, why is the Arbuthnot house called that? And it's usually because that's the name of the first occupant. That's the name of the person who probably first built the house and occupied it in the first few years. Here, I've expanded the search a little bit. So in addition to putting in a keyword Armstrong's Point, I said, and Westgate. In other words, I only want to see houses that are on Westgate, one of the three main roads in Armstrong's Point, Westgate, Middlegate, and Eastgate. I only want to see the ones that are on Westgate, so that's what it's showing me. Or maybe I want to see houses that were built in the 1910s. So one of the pieces of data in our database is the year that a particular building was constructed. We don't have the information for a lot of the buildings, but when we do, we add it to the database. So in this case, we've added the year of construction for the houses in Armstrong's Point. So I put year equals 191. Now, of course, that isn't a year, and you might think, well, why did I put that? Well, because that's a generic version of the 1910s. In other words, that will match any house built in 1910, 11, 12, 13, all the way up to 1919. It'll find any house built in that 10-year period. If I search year equals 191. If I want to see houses built in the 1920s, year equals 192. If I wanted to find houses built only in 1912, I could put year equals 1912, and it'll do that as well. So that's one of the sort of bits of metadata that's in the database that you can search. Or another piece of metadata is that we have put in, whenever known, the name of the architect who designed the building. So in this case, you can put arc equals Bridgman for the architect Charles Bridgman, and it'll show you the houses in Armstrong's Point that he designed. So that's another little tip you can find. Or we put in some cases the material from which the building is built. If you put mat equals brick, it'll find brick buildings. Mat equals stone, it'll find stone buildings, and so on. There's other keywords too. In fact, there's lots of keywords that you won't necessarily know. We haven't been publicizing them mainly because a lot of them aren't complete. In other words, a lot of buildings we don't have the information in, and we don't want people to think that the information isn't known. It's just that it isn't in the database. And in fact, if anyone hearing this presentation is interested in helping us, one of the ways you can do that is by helping us add metadata to the database, and that would make it a richer searching experience for everybody. So what do we can use this map for? Well, one purpose, I think, is for heritage tourism. A lot of people enjoy heritage. You know, maybe, for example, they come to the Forks, an historic place, and they see lots of monuments, and they may not know much about those monuments beyond what they can read on the monument itself, but because these all link to something online, we can find all kinds of information. We can refer people to more information about a particular site by going online. So in this version of the map, you can see all of the blue monuments shown here, and you can click on any one of them, and it will show you more information about that particular site. And the way the map is designed is to show things in your vicinity. So if you're walking around, in theory, it could give you a virtual tour. As you're walking down a street or as you're driving in your car, it can show you the things that are nearby you. I think it could be useful for historical research, for genealogical research. You know, you can investigate the lives of past Manitobans, you know, because if they say, for example, that they were born at a particular place, you can search that place and find out what is nearby. Maybe you can find the cemetery where they were buried after they died. Maybe you can find the church they attended. Maybe you can find the school they attended, or the business where they worked, or the home in which they lived. You know, when you know the geography of the person, you can find all sorts of useful information. We have all kinds of information on the MHS website about the municipalities of the province, the various schools around the province, cemeteries, and more. There's piles of information on our website. We have thousands of pages of information. And sometimes this map is the starting point to find more information about those various pages that we have. And I think this could serve a very useful purpose, especially in this day and age when we have access to technology for virtual historical tours. In other words, people could walk the street of some town that they cannot visit. Maybe it's somebody from some place far away who simply cannot visit the town of Wascata, but they can walk the street of Wascata and see the buildings, and they can find out about some of those buildings from our tour. And I think maybe even more importantly, we can engage students. You know, I've had teachers help in adding sites to this database where they have their students do research on sites, you know, and sometimes they don't know what information they have available to them until they talk to a grandparent. You know, and I think there's really wonderful opportunities for intergenerational conversation, you know, when a student talks to their grandparent and says, hey, you know, where did you go to school? Is the school still there? If it isn't, where was that school? Tell me about the school, you know, or if there's something else that you know, something that you find noteworthy, tell me about it, and maybe we can nominate it for inclusion on the map. So I think this has real educational possibilities as well. And I think fundamentally, it serves to democratize history. In other words, all of us can participate. You know, we can all feel that we make a contribution. We don't have to wait for someone to go out and designate something as officially important. You know, we don't have to wait for a municipal, a provincial, or a federal government to say this site has importance. We can do it ourselves. We can collect information that may be in only a few places, information that may only reside in a few people's heads and nowhere else. You know, information that is going to be lost within the next generation. We can preserve it in this way. We make the information available freely and publicly. I also feel very strongly that everybody should be acknowledged. And if somebody therefore contributes information, whether it's all of the information about a particular site or whether it's just partial information, that we say, this is thanks to so-and-so, that we acknowledge them explicitly. We can also correct mistakes. I am not going to say that that all of the pages are error-free. There are mistakes, and sometimes it's simply through misunderstanding. Sometimes it's because of incomplete information. But the nice thing about putting it online is that it's easily corrected, and we do correct it. Anytime I get advice that something is wrong or is not complete, I'll usually correct it as quickly as I possibly can. And of course, we can add new information as we get it available. So it seems to me that this is a perfect opportunity for participation. And that's why what I'd like to wrap up with is an appeal to everybody listening to help us expand this collection. Anybody that has information about interesting historic sites, go online, check out our inventory, search it to see if you can find out if we've been there already. If we haven't been, or if you're not sure, by all means, contribute it. You know, so, for example, we haven't been especially thorough at covering the southeastern part of Manitoba or northern Manitoba. And we would love to have people advise us about historic sites in that part of the province. But even if a site has been visited before, you know, it's always valuable to get new photographs, you know, because frankly, buildings disappear. You know, the building that got burned is gone, you know, and having a picture can show us how buildings progress, how they change, if the configuration of the building changes, if new additions are made to it, or if it's reconfigured in some way, or if the building is destroyed altogether. Having pictures at various times is useful. Checking the GPS locations. I always take as precise a measurement as I can take with my GPS when I'm visiting a site, but I'll be the first to admit, sometimes the coordinates are not as exact as I'd like them to be. And if you can get better ones, all the better. I'd like them to be so accurate that they can take you right to the site of, well, the things like the Deloraine bank fault. And of course, more detail is always welcome. So, for example, all those one-room schoolhouses, we're trying to compile lists of the names of the teachers at those schools through the years. We can get this information from local history books, from local informants, from archives, from libraries. Same with grain elevators, the names of the people who operated those elevators. And a lot of sites, the names of churches, we have the names of the clerics who ministered there. There's lots of information that can be added, and it simply makes each of the sites that is in this collection richer. There's no need for you to have all of the information up front. It seems to me that when it's online, you can expand it. And so this is a project that I don't envision is going to be done anytime soon. I in fact, foresee that this could go on indefinitely, going on for decades more as we get a richer and richer collection of historic information. And you'll never know what you're going to find when you go out traveling, when you see the beautiful parts of Manitoba. I'm very proud to be a Manitoban. And I love to find new things. And I think you will find when you're out and traveling, you will learn things about Manitoba that you never knew. So I encourage you to go out and travel. So just to inspire you, I'll end with this last picture. Here I am standing on top of what looks like, it looks like a concrete tree stump. And that's exactly what it is. It was built in the late 1950s along the Trans-Canada Highway between Haddishville and Richer. And the idea was that it was going to be the base for a large statue of Smokey the Bear. The idea being is that this area had been burned in a forest fire, and 3 young men lost their lives as a result of what turned out to be an arson fire. And so the provincial government was going to put up a monument to commemorate these young men that died by encouraging everybody to be vigilant about forest fires and to use the symbol of forest fire suppression, which of course is Smokey the Bear. Well, unfortunately, the highway got relocated and the monument, the base that was built, wasn't quite next to the highway. Maybe the plans were changed, I don't know. Well, for whatever reason, the Smokey never got built, and the forest reclaimed the site. Just recently, in the last few years, it was discovered again. It was right along the highway, but it had been kind of overlooked because it was surrounded by trees. As you can see in this photo, the trees were removed because they were digging some gravel. And lo and behold, here is the tree stump from the late 1950s. And, there's not a great history about it. It's not, earth-shakingly significant, perhaps, but it's still an interesting reflection of our history, and I think places like this should be preserved. So with that, I will conclude. I'll thank you for your attention. I'll say if you do have anything you'd like to share, if you have any questions about anything I've talked about, if you'd like to know more about this project or anything that the Manitoba Historical Society does, please, by all means, get in touch with me. Thank you for your attention today. Bye-bye.